You're on.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Some technical difficulties on our end, but we are ready to go. Welcome to Post Talk Live. I'm Jamie Lee. I'm the deputy editor at Endpoints News. If you're joining us for the first time, hello. Post Talk Live is our show that brings you the reporting, analysis, and debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom. If you're joining us on YouTube, hit that subscribe button to get alerts about future live streams, or you can sign up for the Post Talk newsletter on your Endpoints News subscription page. So we are coming to you just a few hours after the newly reassembled ACIP met for the first time. In case you missed this, earlier this month, RFK Jr. fired all 17 members of the committee and replaced them with 8 new members, some of whom are vaccine critics. So to say the least, some of the people, companies, and organizations who work on vaccine policy had concerns ahead of this meeting. So I'm joined here today by senior reporter Max Bayer and senior editor Zach Brennan. Both of them have been closely covering these topics over the last few months. And one more thing, for those of you joining us on YouTube today, you can use the live chat to join the conversation and ask us questions. You'll also be able to find the recordings live on YouTube and Spotify after we wrap up. So Max, Zach, welcome to Post Talk Live. I'm super excited to chat with you today about all of this. So to start, I think we should take a step back and talk about why this week was so important. So we had ACIP's first meeting since RFK restructured it. We had, you both noted that one member ended up bowing out before it even started, another abstained from voting over some concerns around the language. We had Trump's second nominee for CDC director went before the Senate, and RFK himself was also testifying on the Hill. So what else am I missing, and what is this the events of this week kind of tell us about what's happening right now with vaccine policy?
It's hard.
It's a lot just to get started,
Yeah,
but
right. It's a lot. I think I think from what it tells us about vaccine policy, sort of speaking about ACIP specifically, is that you know, vaccine manufacturers in broad strokes are going to be going up against preconceived notions about these products. Um and I mean that to say that there were different instances where outside research or outside interpretations of research from some of the new committee members would be referenced in response to some of the data that was provided by the CDC. Um, and so that's sort of like a macro way to sort of say that like there were points throughout the last 2 days where there were certainly fair questions about the data that CDC experts were presenting to the panel. And there were also times when they were sort of meant to fact check some of the research or some of the thinking that those panelists were providing back. And that came up in different points throughout um, the 2 day committee hearing. I think just one point of sort of why this, beyond just why this was sort of such a closely watched hearing is that it was done very quickly. Suffice it, like, usually there are months in the making. There are presentations to these subgroups called working groups within ACIP. Obviously, these folks were named 2 weeks ago, essentially. And so I think it was like sort of the agenda was truncated, and then also just clearly everyone was sort of like getting up to speed live. So that was also sort of setting the scene a little bit for that committee.
got it. Zach, I'm curious, with your coverage this week, what stood out to you and what it kind of tells you about this administration and their approach to vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything Max said, and I would also say it seems like a lot of issues that I think a lot of people thought were settled science are kind of being reinvestigated and relitigated in these ACIP presentations, in these comments made on Twitter via RFK, and in his testimony before this House subcommittee this week. And, we saw him get in a couple of fights with some Democratic members, and he kind of charged at them that they're supported by pharma, they're supported by big pharma. And then, in the ACIP meeting, I think we saw kind of a lot of questions, even like very basic foundational questions that I think you don't usually see in a lot of these meetings, for better or for worse. And I think some of the members even kind of commented on that like, We're seeing some layperson presentations, some scientific presentations, and it's this kind of strange mix of lots of newcomers on ACIP's panel. I think the newness of the panelists was very apparent in the
Got
last 2
it.
days. Yeah.
Got it. And when we look at ACIP, like Max, I think how does this committee function? How much of a departure was this, these 2 days of hearings or meetings compared to the way it's been done in the past?
Well, to the point, of who now makes up this committee, I think for starters, one of the weird things was how much there was sort of a basic like CDC was spending a lot of time sort of describing its basic surveillance systems at times. And so like they clearly understood the assignment and what they were up against in some way of like, for better or for worse, we sort of have to teach some of these people what we do. And I'm sure for different members of the committee, there was varying, levels of understanding. Vicky Pebsworth, for example, has been, I think, a consumer rep on VRBPAC meetings in the past. There are folks who sort of have understood what advisory committees, grant that's the FDA's, but there have been just varying degrees, but they were sort of presenting sort of like an intro, sort of thinking about it as like a ACIP 101. And so I think that sort of first was sort of telling about like who they are presenting to when in historically, I mean, these are usually the top infectious disease researchers around the country and other folks as well, family physicians and things. But so that sort of set the stage. Um, an interesting thing is that at the beginning of the meeting, Martin Koldorf, the new chair, referenced these two new working groups that they're going to launch. One that's going to sort of look at the cumulative effects of the childhood vaccine schedule, another that's going to look at vaccines that haven't been, in his words, sort of reviewed in more than 7 years. But it seemed like, first, we don't really know who's going to be on those committees yet, both from a non-voting liaison or actual voting members. Um, and it already sort of seemed like he was mentioning the topics of that working group and almost seemingly suggesting what the conclusions of that working group would be. That would never sort of necessarily happen in the past, sort of getting ahead of your skis like that. And then today, I think this was maybe the biggest point of contention over the 2-day meeting, and we'll get into this more about the conversation about thimerosal, which is this preservative in a number of different products, but namely in the flu vaccines. There was one presentation from someone speaking in their own personal capacity, not anyone from the CDC. There was no evidence to recommendation framework, which is a sort of clunky way to say a in-depth presentation about the benefits of a certain recommendation, the harms of a certain recommendation. Sometimes those include the costs of a certain recommendation. That didn't happen, and non-voting liaisons raised serious concerns with that lack of protocol as well. So there were some elements to the meeting that were standard. There were a lot of things that seemed to be sort of a little willy-nilly. And I think the combination of that sort of was broadly a departure.
Got it. And I mean, to kind of take this a little bit further, when we our newsroom Slack, you described this as one of the weirdest events you've ever covered. What just made it so different than past meetings or even the way we cover drug regulation and policy the rest of the time?
The people making the decisions had to be convinced that these were products worth administering generally. And usually these are people who understand the benefits and risks of vaccination or immunization, and they are hearing, through the public comment section or otherwise, you know, concerns to rein it in. So the script was completely flipped, and I think that's sort of what made it weird. I was texting with another reporter during this about this exact point. Like, you're just watching a lot of people, including Cody Meisner, who is the only former ACIP member named to this new committee, who was so frequently like, I don't mean to sort of put it this way, but he almost acted like this, quote, voice of reason, in a way. And I put that in quotes just because to not to ascribe that title to him, and because he didn't say that, but like, at times he was someone who used to work on the RSV working group, and he would say things like, these are great products, like, people are like really scrutinizing them, and he had to sort of remind people like, This used to be, we didn't used to have these. Some of the youngest babies used to die in the hospital with this illness. So he was constantly kind of trying to remind people of like, this is a big scientific advancement, and we should sort of like think about it in that paradigm and scrutinize data significantly, but also like, what are we trying to do here? We are trying to stop infant children from getting sick with a severe respiratory illness before their immune system has developed. That was weird. And I think like that sort of was a through line is like between the non-voting liaisons, the CDC members presenting, Cody Meisner, it was like these different groups trying to remind people why they were there, what their role was. I think I even made a note at times people at times some of the committee members would be referencing recommendations as approvals, which to me was it was not lost on me because I think one of the biggest issues raised in how some of these new members might view their role is almost to negate an approval from the FDA. So it was like reframing their role from recommendations to relitigating products that the FDA has already decided on. That was clear throughout. And I think I noted at one point, and we'll get into RSV as well, that immediately I think people misunderstood the assignment there, and that was happening frequently.
Got it. Got it. And actually on the on RSV, so the ACIP members, the new ACIP members did vote in favor of Merck's new RSV treatment. Zach, I know you've done some coverage here and are pretty tuned in. Was this a surprising conclusion?
So,
What's
yeah.
your on this?
So the vote itself was not surprising. What was surprising was that we saw two members who voted against the CDC recommending this monoclonal antibody, and then turning around in the second vote and recommending it for the children's vaccines program, which is where millions of children nationwide get their vaccines. So it was very strange to see them, like it didn't make any sense why they wouldn't recommend the antibody and then they would turn right around and say, oh, but it's okay for the children's vaccine program. It was unclear to me if like they didn't understand why, like what their responses meant or what was going on. But to Max's point too, I think there was kind of a strong political infusion too, right? Like we saw the woman who gave the presentation on thimerosal is now an appointee to HHS, an advisor to RFK, and she previously worked for Children's Health Defense, which RFK was affiliated with. And then we saw Tracy Beth Hogue from the FDA, who's a political appointee, who was kind of representing the FDA at the meeting. I mean, we haven't really seen this many political appointees getting this involved in kind of the nitty gritty of the decisions.
Really interesting. And so you also mentioned, there was, I believe there was a second vote around thimerosal. Is that correct in flu vaccines?
There were essentially three votes on
Got it.
thimerosal. One about whether flu vaccines for pregnant women should include it, children, and then all adults should
Okay.
have.
And so, so it was recommended that it's dropped from the flu vaccines. And so, if you can just kind of walk us through, this topic, which is obviously very like a high, hot topic. But what were the panelists saying? How is this different than this discussion if it was ever there in past ACIP?
Right. So I'm going to do my best here as fully acknowledging that I'm but a lowly journalist and no real expert. I'm doing my best here, sort of condensing the information from the experts that I know. But suffice it to say that thimerosal is a preservative. It has been used in products, including vaccines, multi-dose vials specifically. I think it helps maintain those products essentially. But it has been a point of contention in a lot of folks who are skeptical about vaccines and their development, mostly because it breaks down into a form of mercury. And so it sort of then ties into mercury buildup in the body and the impact of mercury as a neurotoxin. So let's just fast forward this debate. I think the Children's Health Defense and Lynn Redwood have long pointed to thimerosal as one of those ingredients in vaccines that causes or is linked to, I should say, autism. right? So let's just sort of get down to brass tacks here. That is sort of the root issue, that thimerosal might be contributing to rising autism rates. It has been a point of contention for a while. The CDC, the FDA have long said that the thimerosal in vaccines is safe. It breaks down into a form of mercury that is not the same as the kind that we watch out for in, say, fish. Still, that has not been persuasive for folks who have still, I think what's hard here is folks are citing studies. You don't know the legitimacy of those studies, and it's not coming from the people who are certainly at least the majority of clinicians who are recommending or administering vaccines. So I think that's why I sort of take them with a grain of salt. But Lynn's presentation was chock full of citations, albeit the New York Times flagged one of them earlier and it was removed. So this has been an issue. And so thimerosal is this ingredient that has already been sort of litigated and is now sort of back in, the limelight here. Cody Meisner made this point of like, why are we really talking about this? He noted that it's really important. Multi-dose vials are very important in lower income countries that don't have the same storage mechanism. So he's sort of worried about the implications there. And that sort of teed up this vote that we had today. I hope that sort of answers the question of what was discussed and how we got here. And I think most of the committee members, again, sort of had already feelings about thimerosal before this presentation even.
Yeah, I would only add too that like it seems like from what we've said and reported that the majority of flu vaccines currently do not contain thimerosal. So it would only be a small fraction of the flu vaccines that might have to be reworked potentially. Right. And and Cody Meisner, who was kind of like the resident expert throughout the whole day, was the one dissenting vote on all three of those votes around whether or not to recommend that they don't include thimerosal anymore. And he also kind of raised the whole safety question of like, where's the data? We haven't really seen legitimate data showing that this is harmful. And this is kind of a relitigation. And again, we saw the relitigation in the presentation just preceding these votes from the co-chair Koldorf around the MMR vaccine, which was also, I don't know, bizarre from my perspective, just because it was like, why is he making this presentation right now? They're not voting on this. In the end, he kind of made this nebulous, like, I guess we'll get into this later on comment that was kind of like, I don't, what is this for? Like, what are you it wasn't any new data, right? I don't know. I think
they didn't even, yeah. So one thing to your first point, thank you for reminding me. Tracy Beth Hoag mentioned that about 4 to 5% of flu vaccines in the 2024-2025 season were multi-dose vials, which I insinuated to me and had thimerosal in them. And then to your point, Zach, right? So, my understanding is normally a presentation on any of these vaccines is led by a CDC, someone at the CDC, or at least someone from sort of this working group. But now we don't really know who's on these working groups. So it was a little strange to me that Koldorf sort of led this presentation of MMR, and that was actually sort of they really sort of sped through the back end of today's agenda. They had a presentation on anthrax vaccines that preceded that. There was no discussion. There was MMR presentation that they didn't really talk about, and then they sort of were like, okay, we're voting now. And so it was just a little strange what they decided to include and what they didn't include, and who led those presentations as well without CDC input.
Interesting. Did it almost feel like the meeting kind of functioned as a platform for people to raise concerns, or whether those in scientific community or lay people, about various vaccine concerns in a way that maybe was different than it had been in the past?
So I will say, I thought it was interesting. There were a couple questions around, I think it was with the Merck monoclonal antibody about its concomitant administration with other vaccines. That's something that we've heard from President Trump too, right? It's like, we have all these vaccines, why do we give them all at the same time? And the CDC like went through they have lots of real world data on the use of multiple vaccines, the administration of multiple vaccines at the same time for infants, and showed that like there weren't any safety signals, there weren't any But we saw that question come up several times, I would say. I don't, anything else you saw, Max?
Um, yeah, I think like, to your question, Jamie, it definitely felt like an opportunity for people who have had their own siloed communication corridors, if you will, or their own Substacks. In the case of some folks, Robert Malone, at least, is one whose Substack I think has north of 350,000 subscribers, more than 1 million X followers, and sort of like, I'll admit, it was broadly cordial, but I do think the general like situation was like, we're coming in with our data, you're gonna have your data, let's like duke it out on data, and like that felt like the scene setting. It wasn't like interrogating. It was, let me put it this way. There was an insinuation that there were critiques about the CDC's data just on principle and what they were and were not catching, as opposed to assessing the data as it was presented. So there was an innate distrust or scrutiny of CDC's data collection and what they were presenting at a baseline. And I think that like that was voiced often. To go to the RSV, Retzef Levy starts today by saying, they had just gotten all this review of RSV vaccines the day before. They had to sort of push the agenda out because of timing. And he starts and he's like, I have reviewed the clinical trial data of Beyfortus, which wasn't even up for discussion, and then Merck's, monoclonal antibody as well. I would like the CDC to respond. And so like that was kind of like, all right, like not talking about the data, the multiple dozens of slides on RSV data presented the day before. It was like, thank you for that. I've checked this out myself. Why don't you respond? And like that got today started. I mean, that was the first half hour of today.
Interesting, interesting. And so, well, I guess on that note, let's jump over to another sometimes controversial topic, which is mRNA vaccines. So, how often did mRNA come up at the 2-day event? What was the tone and tenor of that conversation? What were you hearing?
Tone was actually more muted and chill than I expected it to be. It came up yesterday. Notably, there was not a vote on the COVID-19 vaccines. I think we are expecting now an additional ACIP meeting before the fall to actually recommend them. We will see if this is still the committee makeup at that time, but I digress. The general vibe was, because these are folks, generally speaking, who do have a lot of scrutiny about the mRNA vaccines. The one thing that sort of came up, people had generally, interesting points about it. I think Retzef, Levy, and Robert Malone were sort of asking whether the CDC safety surveillance systems are sort of able to pick up on some of the safety issues that they have discussed related to the technology itself. Robert Malone specifically asked, about maybe immune system dysregulation as a result. And they made clear that there is sort of this process by which there are not only specific, the CDC that is, has specific conditions they're like watching out for, but also this like data pickup process that is tracking 60,000 additional other conditions that could potentially be picked up on. So the long and the short of that answer was like, if anything arises abnormally, we are going to pick it up. And I think that was maybe an area where they were clearly sort of having to address, the CDC that is having to address like, you know, an issue that these folks have had with the vaccines, put in maybe a bit more of like a kind uh, tone, if that makes sense.
Got it. Got it. Very interesting. And then actually going back to something that we were chatting about a few minutes ago, is a question for you, Zach. I would describe this as kind of like procedural changes during the meeting, but and I think you mentioned this at the very earliest part of the live presentation here. But if you can talk a little bit about the kind of difference between presentations from kind of everyday folks giving their perspective to scientists, like how and how this differs than it did in the past.
Yeah, so it was interesting, and there were several comments. I forget who specifically said it, but there were kind of questions about why they were being presented information that a layperson might be presented, and why they weren't kind of looking at deeper data on some of these subjects. And that was kind of an open question. And we also saw, some peculiar questions from, I think it was Dr. Levy, who was kind of raised some questions about the numerics of the deaths that were reported in the clinical trial for the Merck monoclonal. And it was like he didn't quite understand what they repeated like several times that the deaths were unrelated to the treatment, but he kind of kept repeating that like numerically the numbers are going up and up. It's like, I don't know. There seemed to be lots of kind of fundamental disagreements around some of the data at certain points that I think it, I don't know. I guess we'll see kind of how that plays out in future votes and in future decisions behind voting. But I do think kind of the bright spot in all of this is that Susan Monarez, who testified this week, does seem to be someone who, openly supports vaccines, doesn't think there's a link between vaccines and autism, and she ultimately like signs off on the ACIP's recommendations. And she, was very kind of honest and concerted about, how or what her role would involve with those decisions. So I think at the very end of the day, at least people know that there's someone who could be coming into CDC, pending confirmation vote that, isn't as, I guess, just by comparison, when you think back to like RFK's testimony and confirmation hearings, when they asked him, whether or not he thinks there's a link between vaccines and autism, he, declined to answer. She was, nothing like that. So I don't know. I think there's some positives ahead, or at least, kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with Susan, what's her background? Was she in industry before this? Government? I know she's been acting director, I believe, since January, but kind of curious
Yeah,
what that's been.
yeah, she's been acting director at CDC, and prior to that, she was deputy director at ARPA-H. She worked under the Biden administration as well. So I think she's very different from, say, the Makari, the Oz, and I guess that type of political appointee. But and it seemed like, at least from her confirmation hearing, there was no one who seemed to be saying that they weren't going to vote for her, or were raising like very serious questions about her background or her understanding of the knowledge of public health or anything like
that. Yeah, interesting. And then I guess jumping over to the third major event of the week, which was RFK testifying, I believe it's for like a House subcommittee. But, what stood out to you in that hearing? I know, Zach, you've been covering a ton of this stuff, but just kind of curious if there was anything different or unique about what he was saying to lawmakers this week.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say a lot. It was more of the same. It seemed like a lot of members have been asking him questions via writing and trying to call his staff, and they haven't been able to get any responses yet, which, as reporters, we can all kind of make similar complaints. But but yeah, I don't know. It wasn't like it, I guess the bar for what RFK can say that would surprise me has gotten so low that I'm not that shocked. I mean, it seems like he's willing to defend the 10,000 staff cuts. He thinks that they're moving in the right direction. He thinks that the work that he's doing on ACIP is going to save children's lives, and he thinks that people who oppose him are generally in the pockets of big pharma, at least, the members that he was getting in arguments with. So yeah, I mean, Max, go ahead. Did you have?
Well, there's just two things that I thought were interesting. One was this back and forth over whether firing all the ACIP members was a rebuke or a reneging of a commitment he had made to Senator Cassidy to earn that spot. Just being, this is unfortunately a semantics like a semantics issue. As he said in his when he spoke in the Senate to sort of explain his rationale, apparently he agreed with Kennedy that Kennedy wouldn't make any changes to ACIP's recommendations. he obviously has done that as well through the COVID-19 vaccine. So I'm not trying to like, say that he hasn't sort of gone back on that. I will just say that like as it was said by Senator Cassidy, he did not agree to upend that panel. The other thing that I think really pertains to our readers is there were a number of senators, I think specifically on the Republican side, who were wanting to stress the need for more rare disease treatments in light of stealth biotherapeutics rejection. One member specifically mentioned Barr syndrome. So I know that there has been some, at least just what I've seen online, there have been folks who have really been trying to hammer the administration in light of that rejection, really wanting that drug, that Barr syndrome drug, to be available. So I am going to be watching to see whether there's any backroom lobbying or push from Republicans or anybody else to, change that decision, which would be interesting to say the least if that happens.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Oh, go ahead,
just
Zach.
no, and just adding to that, I was kind of surprised that you just reminded me, Max, that he did make several comments that I think were a lot more pro biotech than I think people were
Yep.
aware of in the past. And he made kind of a semi-pledge that he wanted to work with Congress to add the pill penalty fix to the big beautiful bill. And he was talking about, like making biotech great again. We're going to be at the center of the biotech ecosystem, and
China.
U.S. versus China fight. We're going to beat China, that kind of thing. So I don't know. I think the XBI investor folks out there can maybe like relax a little bit, because he did seem very like, we're going to approve like the latest greatest biotech products in the world faster than anyone else. So I don't know. Maybe some hope there.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was actually going to be my question for both of you. But I believe it was Make American Biotech Accelerate. Is
That's
it?
it.
Yeah,
That's it.
got it. Well, I think on that note, to kind of step back, and we obviously, our audience is the biopharma industry, between ACIP, the RFK hearing, and the potential CDC director nominee, what can an industry take away this week from these events? Like, what do they need to know or think about as they kind of, look to the future? What stood out to you in that way?
Yeah.
Silence.
Yeah.
Bad time
Okay.
to be an analyst, honestly. I think my takeaway is like bad time to be an analyst trying to take like a single news event and like project it even a week into the future. Like I think like in the same week that our colleague Andy reported on, the FDA commissioner getting involved in a single application, you have the secretary making broader proclamations about the industry as a whole. So like, how do you sit with that? You have the FDA continuing to approve vaccines, albeit with a more limited label, and continuing to approve RSV antibodies. And then you have ACIP that is clearly seeing its role as sort of reassessing those approvals and definitely scrutinizing their recommendations, which could have serious uptake and thus revenue impacts on infectious disease products. So I think like until proven otherwise, like people should really get used to this sort of like, like sort of switching from your left foot to your right foot a little bit, like hopping around on like on continued strategy. I think like the FDA commissioner and Vinay Prasad, the new CBER head, are I think they have one or two more stops on this biotech CEO tour. Broadly, people, when we reported on that, I think have been happy with those meetings, have felt heard in those meetings. I think the question is whether they actually get to see it in policy that they find is consistent, helpful, and like addressing their needs and being implemented in a way that like actually works. And I think, Zach can obviously hit a little bit more on how this is all going on with a broader FDA staff that I think is still trying to figure out their role.
Yeah, right. I guess I'm also kind of hesitant to be like, all trains are go right now, just because a lot of the stuff we've seen so far could be carryover work from the previous administration. And, there's people I've spoken to in the Office of Prescription Drug Policy at the FDA who've been like, everything that they've put out so far are things that we were working on like in 2024. So I think we've still yet to see whether or not, PDUFA dates get delayed in a more widespread manner because of some of these cuts. But I do think that, yeah, I think there are some positives to draw from the ACIP meetings and from the testimonies that we saw this week. I don't think it's necessarily like the doom and gloom that all vaccines are going to be thrown out the window, and that we're going to be starting from scratch on a lot of these policy ideas because of who the political appointees are. I think this administration is at least the appointees in the FDA, CDC, and HHS are starting to kind of come around to the fact that oh, we do have a really strong biotech ecosystem that we should be supporting, and it's not all big pharma awfulness that we've been spewing for the last decade or so, or however long. But all things said, you do see these little things where it's the MMR vaccine gets its little presentation, and what are they going to do with that? And then we see thimerosal flu vaccines get thrown out. Okay, there's a little, and these restricted labels on some of the vaccines that we're seeing approvals for. Is this starting to creep in? Are these worldviews kind of starting to creep into some of these decisions? I don't know. I don't think we can say definitively one way or the other yet, but we're certainly seeing some signs, I think.
One other thing I just want to add on ACIP to paint this sort of dichotomy. You have, despite the thimerosal vote, I think it was a unanimous vote to keep recommending annual flu shots to everybody, right? So that happened. You also had Robert Malone, who specifically heralded, I think, some of the vaccines that they were voting on. I definitely flu block from Sanofi. And I think he was also crediting flu mist from AstraZeneca, but was heralding them as sort of great new innovations, thanking the companies. So it was one of the, it's, yeah, we're going to learn more over time. And I think what these people, if you ask them, would tell you is I'm not anti-vaccine. I just, look at the data. And I think I'll leave it to other people to sort of ascribe, direct titles to things. Last thing about what this says about industry, and Kennedy mentioned this a little bit, is MFN negotiations are still ongoing. We don't know what's come of those yet, and we are still waiting on pharma tariffs. So there are arguably the two largest clouds over industry, particularly large pharma, are still forming, and we don't know if those are going to pass or if those are going to be real lightning strikes and thunderstorms. And I think industry is sort of waiting with bated breath on those outcomes.
Okay. I said this last time, but I'm going to say it again. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I would love to talk about this for hours. But thank you for joining us. These are two of the best reporters doing work in this space. So we'll be following ACIP developments and vaccine news closely, as always. And you can keep up with our coverage at endpoints.news, our URL, and by subscribing to our newsletters. So the recording of this conversation is on YouTube and Spotify. And if you for our post-talk newsletter, you'll get notifications when we have a broadcast coming up. If you're not signed up, you're going to head over to endpoint.news, then in the top right-hand corner, hit the reader profile link, then preferences, and click to activate post-talk. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching Endpoints News. A huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Daleen Turk. We will see